Now we're going to work on our French seam. So many of the actions are the same. There's a couple of extra steps and our measurements are going to be different. So we're still going to be using 5/8 within the seam allowance, but we're having a couple steps and doing it in different increments. Now, similar to our last project, we need to be cognizant of the right side and wrong side, or the face and the inside. So I'm going to draw a little pattern on one side of the fabric to indicate right or wrong. Now, if you want to use patterned fabric so that there is an obvious right and wrong, you're welcome to do that. You have plain fabric in your kit, but again, you can put whatever fabric you want in there. Now, one thing that is different with the French seam than the standard seam we start by sewing right sides together. The French seam, we're going to start sewing the wrong sides together. So a French seam is a way to encase your raw edges within the seam. And this is something that we will do. You might hear it called a lingerie seam, but it's usually a French seam. But it's generally for lighter weight, particularly sheer fabrics. That way you're not adding any extra thread or anything additional that might feel heavy within the fabric, but you're still getting that edge finished off nicely. And it also tends to the end result tends to be a smaller seam allowance. So we're going to start in a similar way. The only difference between how we're starting between the standard seam and this seam is we're starting with wrong sides together. But we'll match up our edges. We will pin along the seam. Now we're going to start the seam not at 5/8, but at 2/8 or 1/4. And on this machine, that lines up pretty much right with the edge of the seam allowance. 1/4 inch is the smallest we're going to want to go, because in order for this to sew easily and evenly, both sides, the fabric on either side of the needle needs to be engaged with the feed dogs. So if I wanted 1/8 of an inch and I scooted it over, now only one side's on the feed dogs and it's not going to feed through evenly. So I'm going to start this at 1/4 inch. Engage your needle, bring your presser foot down, remove the initial needle because it's right at the beginning, take a couple of stitches, back stitch, and then come back forward. And again, we're just guiding. We want to keep this line nice and straight, but we aren't pushing or pulling the fabric through the machine in any way. When we get to the end, we backstitch again. Turn our hand wheel so our looper is at the top. Lift the presser foot. This has a thread cutter on the side here, which is apparently pretty dull. So we're going to just use our reliable old snips. So we sewn, and now we clip, and we're almost ready to press. So what's going to happen next is we're going to take the fabric, and it's going to go right sides together now, and we're going to sew that seam again, but the original raw edge will be encased inside that new seam. So we want to make sure that none of this raw edge comes out of that new seam. So before we press this, we're actually going to trim this seam allowance down even further to about 1/4 inch. But like I said, we don't want to stitch it 1/4 inch because then both sides of the fabric are not engaged on our pressing with our presser foot, our feed dogs, which are under the presser foot. So all right, once we get, this is easier with actual scissors and not just little snips. All right, so now before we sew this again, we want to press this open, and it's a little tricky to press open because it's so small. So what I tend to do with this first, which is really great for cottons, and some of those natural fibers is I will take my finger and press this seam open. It's called finger pressing. And you can do that. And you've probably done this with paper when you're trying to put a crease in it. So I'm just going to kind of open that seam using my finger to press it open, which is going to help me when I go to press it with the iron. The nice thing about natural fibers is they tend to react well to that. So if you see, I've just used my finger to kind of press that open a little bit. And now I'll take my iron and iron that seam open. All right, so now I pressed it so it's nice and flat on both sides. And now what we want to do is we're not matching up edges, we're folding it exactly on this seam. You don't want it to be folded to the side like that. You don't want it folded so that the seam is like inside some little flaps. You want that seam that you just pressed open to be right there visible. That's our edge. And if you wanted, you could come back and press that so it's nice and crisp and flat before you get started. Or you can just pin it, or you can do both. So step 1, wrong sides together, stitch at 1/4 inch, 1/4 or 2/8, backstitch, construction stitch length. Then we trim that seam down, press it open, and now we put the right sides or the face together. And now we're going to come in and we're going to sew at 3/8. So if our first notch, which is 1/4 inch, which is 2/8, our very next one is now going to be 3/8. And you could make this smaller. You'd have to cut your seam allowance smaller, or you could stitch, 3/8 initially and trim it down to 1/4 and then do 2/8. But if you're cutting a 5/8 inch seam, you're going to want to make sure all of the eighths come out of your seam allowance. So we've done 2/8, now we're doing 3. That's your total of 5/8. Or you cut it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then you're just doing 1/4 and 1/4. All right, so we start a couple stitches, back stitch, just guiding this through along the 3/8 inch guide. Come to the end, we back stitch again. Turn our hand wheel so our looper is at the top. Pull away, clip, and clip. Now we can't press this seam open because it's been sealed closed, so we're just going to press it to one side. So there we go, there's our French seam. So it just looks like a regular seam on the outside, but on the inside, instead of having those raw edges now, our raw edges are encased inside the seam. And like I said, this is generally used for lightweight and or mostly sheer fabrics. So that is our French seam, which is the second of your 2 required seams. Got a little thread from that first stitching sticking out. So I'll just pull it, trim it, and now it's gone. All right, French seam.